January 15th, 2011, I attempted to commit suicide by running my car into a tree at 75 miles per hour. And I remember my tires hitting the grass along the highway. And it was one of these moments where I always make the joke or the reference to Carrie Underwood's song, Jesus Take the Wheel. It was one of those moments where I remember my tires hitting the grass and then I don't remember anything else beyond that. What I do remember is that same night, standing in my work 35, 40 miles away from where I had attempted to commit suicide, and somehow I had just gotten there. I couldn't tell you how. I don't remember any of it. It's like I blacked out and reappeared, like a teleport or something. But I was there. And I remember finishing my shift in just a daze, just so confused in this haze of not knowing how I had gotten there, not knowing what had happened when I had attempted to commit suicide. And I remember I got off work that night, and I went home to my apartment, and my roommate was waiting for me at the door. And he said to me, "I called your mom. She's on her way to pick you up." And it was just so mind-boggling how he could have known that I had had these issues, how he had known I had tried to commit suicide. It was all so confusing. But my mom and my dad came and got me. And I ended up moving in with them for a month, 2, 3, can't even remember. Started going back to counseling, trying to get some help. But during this period, I remember my life just kind of felt like it was falling apart. I lost connection with all my friends, lost connection with my fiance, lost my job. Everything fell apart all at the same time. And for about the next year, I just wondered, what was the point? You know, I was 20 years old. I'd had my whole life ahead of me. I was going to be married. I had friends. I had a decent job. And now I had nothing. And I just felt like, man, what was I supposed to do? And I just started to try to rebuild my life. And I had a key friend in that. He was a youth pastor for the Nazarene Church in Oklahoma. And he invited me to come back. We ended up becoming roommates, and he invited me to be a youth sponsor at the Nazarene Church. And looking back now, I realize he just needed me to be there to get me back into church. It had nothing to do with helping the youth. It had nothing to do with being a sponsor. They had plenty of adults more capable than me who could be helping. And yet, there I was, being asked to be a sponsor. And I remember this was his attempt to just get me back into church, and it worked. And I remember this time was kind of the beginning of the process of me kind of moving back towards faith, moving back towards Christianity, moving back towards Jesus. And we used to sit and have long conversations about ministry and churches and how we really felt like the church wasn't doing what it was meant to be doing anymore. And we came up with this idea and this grand vision of opening our own ministry, opening our own church, and doing it in a storefront. And the ministry would be about practical living. We would go out into the community and we would feed homeless people, and we would show compassion and love, and we would pray for people, and we would help out where necessary. And we just had this great vision and this idea, something that sounded amazing. And then a few months of us planning, and it all kind of fell apart. He had to move back to Texas. He was going to go take care of his mom. And so I was just left on my own again. And I remember going back into that state of depression. I stopped going to church. There was no point in me going to the Nazarene Church anymore. They didn't need me as a youth sponsor, or at least that's how I viewed it. I stopped going to church again, started hanging out with people maybe that I shouldn't be hanging out with again, and I started just getting into a bad place. I had turned 21. I had the availability to drink, and it all crumbled. And yeah, I remember in October of 2011, I was getting desperate again, and I had begun to hate my job, life, and started to feel depressed again. So I remember the Lord really just put it upon my heart to call then Captain Gargis with the Salvation Army. And for context, I really didn't know much of anything about the Salvation Army. I had gone to a Christian high school my entire high school career, and the second 2 years was at Wesleyan Christian School in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and we did these service project days where we would go out, help local churches or help local non-Christian nonprofits. And I remember one of those was the Salvation Army. We went and we helped clean out this giant shed full of junk. That's what I remember. But more specifically, I remember they fed us pizza afterwards. And we had this connection with the Salvation Army, one, because they had reached out to the Christian school, but also because Captain Gargus's daughter, Charlesy, went to the same Christian school as me. And so I had this remembering of the Salvation Army. Charlesy and I had been somewhat good friends, I guess. We knew everybody's good friends in Christian schools, I guess, but we were friends. And God putting it on my heart for whatever reason, whatever strange reason, to call Captain Gargus. So I called him with just trying to get an understanding. And I remember just having a brief conversation with him about the Salvation Army, what they do, and he gave me two suggestions. He said, one, you should reach out to the local Salvation Army there. Go and speak to whoever the person was at the time. Go and talk to the pastor, and maybe develop a connection, maybe start volunteering. You never know. I remember thinking about that idea, but then his second option was, he said, if you want, I've got a job for you in an apartment here in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and I'd love for you to come down and work for me. And I was like, man, what an offer. It's just a job offer right off the start. And so I told him I would call him back, and I hung up. And I do remember going and visiting the local Salvation Army in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, but for whatever reason, I just didn't feel comfortable with the setting or the surroundings. I was very nervous about it. I still didn't know much about the Salvation Army. But ultimately, I just never called Captain Gargus back. I just said, thanks for the job offer, but no thanks, without ever telling him that. And I went back to working, and I went back to just doing normal life. And November passed, December passed, January passed, and February passed, and we were coming into March, and I just remember feeling at the lowest point I'd felt since I had attempted suicide a year and some months ago. And so I remember picking up my phone and calling Captain Gargus back and just saying, hey, I know it's a long shot, but is there any chance you still have a job? It was so naive as a young person. I look back now and just go, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? Like, what are the chances that 5 months later that there would still be a job offer? But I remember him saying to me so clearly, yes, I've just been waiting for you to call me back. And when I look back on my journey, I can't help but think that this is one of those moments that God was trying to reveal himself to me in ways he had never revealed himself to me prior. He was simply saying, I have an opportunity for you. You just have to step out in faith. And so I did. I remember going to my boss. I was working for Hastings, a retail company at the time. I went to him and said, hey, I'm going to turn in my 2 weeks. And I remember him being very upset because I had already kind of started walking down this path of becoming a manager, and they had wanted to send me into a manager and training program in the next month or so. But I just really felt like, man, this is an opportunity to get out of here, get out of these surroundings, get out of retail, try something different. So I gave my 2 weeks. I remember calling my parents, and I remember the hesitancy from them. They had seen me go down a lot of different paths. They had seen me try things and fail. They had seen me ultimately just running and attempting to escape my depression. And so I think from their perspective, they probably thought that was what this was. But I moved. I moved to Fort Smith, Arkansas, and started working for the Salvation Army. And I remember when I started working for the Salvation Army, I had this first moment when the first Sunday was coming up. And I remember looking around at the people that I was working with, and everybody attended the church. And I had this moment where I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I hadn't been to church in a long time at that point, and so I just thought to myself, I guess this is what everybody does. They work here, they go to church here. So I started attending the Corps, the Fort Smith Salvation Army Corps Church, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Salvation Army. And I remember it started small. I think Captain Gargus Carlisle put me on the soundboard or something to start. He kept me interested, kept me engaged in the service. And then there came a point where he said to me, I want you to learn this mandolin. He gave me a mandolin, which for those of you who are instrumental know that's not a fairly normal instrument to start with. But he said, I want you to learn this mandolin. And I think he gave me a week. And he said, I'm going to give you a week, and next week you're going to stand on the pulpit and play with me. And he just engaged me in church. He was immersing me in what Christ had for me. And it was astounding, because I had finally found this place where I felt like I belonged. Because for the longest time, I hadn't ever felt like I belonged anywhere. I didn't feel like I belonged in church. I didn't feel like I had a place when I went to church. I didn't feel like the gospel was for me, or Christ had a plan for me specifically. And I had finally found this place where I could be fully immersed in living out what Christ had for me. And it was this transformational time in my life. There was just this month or two where everything became very apparent and clear to me, where I felt God's calling come upon my life, not only to live for him fully, but to live out a life as a pastor, or live out a life as someone who brings the gospel to other people. And I remember saying to my now father-in-law, which is part of my story, Carlisle Gargas, that I was ready to go and train at the Salvation Army Seminary, the training college as it's called. I was ready. I felt God's calling upon my heart so strong. But at the same time, I was still wrestling with my depression. And I think I had been there about a month working for the Salvation Army, going to church. I was still feeling depressed, but I was still feeling this incredible calling from God upon my life. And one Friday afternoon, I had Friday afternoons off, I was sitting and I was studying the Word and I was praying. And I felt this overwhelming desire to just call out to God. And so in my prayer time, I made a demand of God, and I've made very few demands of God in my life as a Christian. Very strong, very open demands of God. But I remember praying to God and saying, if this is what you want me to do, if you want me to minister to people, be a pastor, then you have to take my depression away. I remember saying that to him, you have to do it. And it seems strange to me now to look back and think that even as a young, fully committed Christian at that time, that I demanded something of God. But I did. I demanded it of him. And I remember waking up the next day and just feeling that burden lifted off of me of depression, that burden of God taking it off of me. And it was just another sign that God had called me to this specifically, for this purpose, that he had made a full transformation of who I was so that I would serve him. And on the other side of things, not in my own personal life, but I had started dating Carlisle, my father-in-law's daughter, Charles, and she was away in Mexico during this whole time, and she came back, and it was as if we had been aligned, that God had brought us together and called us together for a specific purpose. And we ended up getting married the following January, moving the following June, and it just became this journey of following Christ through the Salvation Army, that being the vehicle that God was allowing us to be a part of. And when I look back now, I just had this conversation with my mom. When I look back now on my time in Bartlesville, because that's really when my depression started, it's very hard to find good things that came out of that. For both my wife and I, we struggled while we were both living in that town. But I can't say that I regret being there, despite what I went through, despite my depression, despite my suicide attempt, because God had clearly brought me there so that I could meet her, so that I could have a connection with the Salvation Army that would later become instrumental in transforming my life. It was so that later God could take these horrible things that I had been through and turn them and use them for his glory. And no, I'm not claiming that he made me go through those things, but I am claiming that he can use all things for his glory, for his kingdom, for the transformation of souls and lives. So when I look back, I'm very thankful for that time that I went through, because without it, I wouldn't have my calling. I wouldn't have my wife. I wouldn't have my son. I wouldn't have my soon-to-be daughter. So no matter what you're going through, what you may be struggling with, God can use it. God can change it. God can transform it and use it for the good of you, the good of him, the good of the kingdom. So I just want you to be encouraged by that. I want you to be able to see that. And I hope that my story's been beneficial to someone. Know that you shouldn't give up, that life is worth it, that God can transform your story, change your depression, change your anxieties, change your worries, your fears, the things you're struggling with, and use them for good. So that someday you can share your story with someone else and it may transform and change their lives. God bless you, and I hope to see you next week on our next episode of Faithful Footsteps.